Today we have before us Mr. Mark. Is it Tassi or Tassé?
You can say both, but Tassi would
Tassé.
be it.
Okay,
Tassi.
correct. This morning we have with us Mr. Mark Tassé, and he's an award-winning lecturer at the MBA program at Telfer School of Management and the Common Law section of University of Ottawa's Faculty of Law, and also an instructor at the United Nations Global Compact Network, Canada's Anti-Corruption Certificate Program. He's a recipient of the prestigious Trudeau Medal, which, by the way, colleagues, is a medal from 1926 and is different than any Trudeau names that might come up during our meeting. He is a frequent media commentator and a conference speaker. He's been published extensively in Canada and abroad, quoted in various publications such as the Wall Street Journal, and delivers presentations at the Harvard Institute for Learning and Retirement. So, Mr. Tassé, it's great to have you with us today. Please go ahead for 7 minutes with your opening remarks, and then we'll go to our rounds of questions and answers.
Perfect. Thank you very much. So, dear Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, in time of global crisis, the worst and best human behaviors are noticeable as a result of the declaration of a state of health emergency. The abolition of certain internal controls procedures for awarding contracts makes the federal government vulnerable to fraud, corruption, embezzlement, undue influence, and most of all, conflict of interest. With the introduction of tens of billions of dollars in new federal aid programs, oversight and accountability are becoming unavoidable paradigms. Thus, alternative measures must be put in place to compensate for the revocation of certain internal compliance control. While rapid action is needed in time of crisis, maintaining an adequate level of due diligence at the supply chain level is essential to prevent corruption, fraud, and other illegal and unethical practices. The reputation of the government and the credibility of the program depends on it. First, let's define a conflict of interest. So, a conflict of interest may arise in all environments and sometimes irrespectively of the will of the public official. Every person has private interests. Civil servants, however, have a duty to serve the public interest and to make decisions using criteria in an impartial manner. If not managed appropriately and left unresolved, a conflict of interest can lead to corruption. As seen from the definition above, in situations of conflict of interest, the private capacity interests of the public official may improperly influence the decision-making process. There is three different types of conflict of interest. The first one is what we call the actual, or if you prefer, the real conflict of interest, which involves a situation where the official private capacity interest is already in conflict with his or her duty to perform in the public interest. The second one is a potential or a future conflict of interest, which involves a situation where the official's private capacity interest does not yet come into conflict with his or her duty to perform in the public interest, but may do so in the future. And the third one is an apparent conflict of interest, and that would involve a situation where the official's private capacity interest look as if it is in conflict with his or her duty to perform in the public interest, although this is not the case. So there's three different types of conflict of interest. And how do we deal with that? Well, first of all, a duty is imposed on officials to disclose any conflict of interest and, if directed to do so by their superior or the relevant public sector body, to apply a management strategy such as recusal, removal, or even the resignation from duties to mitigate the risk of corruption or loss of trust. I strongly believe that all laws need teeth to ensure compliance. Whether it is increasing awareness among public office holders of the law and its code, or penalizing those who accept to be lobbied when they know they are dealing with a public service holder without authorization, it must be looked at it in a way to encourage compliance and discourage any inadvertent or willful disregard from the laws and codes of ethics. As I said in my opening remarks, the degree of due diligence should be commensurate with the urgency in which decisions are made, because transparency must prevail and is fundamental in maintaining the public trust in our institution. Yes, decision can be made urgently, but we have the mechanism to transparently review those decisions during or after the fact and hold decision makers accountable for those decisions. For sure, mistakes may be made, but the key is to have mechanisms that allow for urgent decision to be made, but not at the long-term cost of the reduction of the public trust or good governance. In public contract, the most basic caution requires a comprehensive justification and documentation of the decision-making process recommendation, recommending the award of a non-tender contract. When it comes to awarding a sole source contract to an entity, it is crucial that some questions are specifically answered as follows. Then I'm going to name you a list of 15. I know it's long, but it's very important. First one, does the entity have impeccable probity? Second one, does the entity have the technical skills? Does the entity have the human resource to carry out the mandate properly? Does the entity have a transparent legal structure? Do the entity have a stable governance structure? Does the entity have the financial stability to complete the contract? Were audit of the entity's officers carried out prior to the award of the contract? Was the contract awarded in an emergency or personal safety context? Were apparent, potential, and actual conflict of interest issue assessed prior to the award of the contract? Is the contract guided by due diligence with respect to the department's interests? Is the contract typical of the relationship between a department and an entity? Does the contract include a clause relating to ongoing monitoring of the ethics and compliance program of the entity that is considered to be retained? Does the contract include anti-corruption clauses? Does the contract contain clauses for the recovery of embezzled funds? And finally, was there a legal validation of the contract prior to its awarding? In conclusion, I think there's a couple of questions that the committee has to ask himself. Could the vulnerability known at all levels, but particularly in government contracts since the beginning of the pandemic, have been prevented with better pre-pandemic planning? In other words, are the laws that serve as a framework for the proper management of public funds to ensure value for money, the absence of conflict of interest, appropriate lobbying, rules for offer to purchase, and so on, are they suitable for the context of a pandemic or other type of emergency? Another question that the committee should ask itself is, do the administrator of these laws and the status themselves have sufficient resources and teeth to prevent, detect, and punish violation of these laws, and in particular, conflict of interest in emergency condition that requires greater transparency and integrity to maintain Canadian confidence in its institutions? The public has a right to transparency because taxpayer money is spent. The appearance of a conflict of interest is as damaging to public trust as the actual conflict, in my view. Again, in my view, there's a direct relationship between the urgency of decision-making in these pandemic situations and a proportionate and high degree of transparency, oversight, and consequences for violation of those laws. In this time of a global pandemic where wrongdoing can lead to reputationally damaging administrative or judicial action, the government must set an example and strengthen its reputation for integrity. The government and senior officials need to be more vigilant and strengthen structures to reduce the risk of favorism and clientelism in awarding contract. Although emergency exemption may be permitted to award sole source contract, they must also be necessary and non-selective as they provide possible bypass route for deviant actors. Canada has an efficient rule-based procurement system. Therefore, the government and senior official just have to use it properly and follow the rules. One last word. Beyond the prevention of fraudulent behavior through laws or norms that are added to an already existing arsenal, it would be wise to also think about ethics and support program for individuals in position of power in order to anchor a true ethical work culture based on discernment and questioning before making decisions. So thank you very much, and I'm now available to answer any of your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Tissé. We'll move on to the first round of questions, and we'll start with Mr. Barrett for 6 minutes.
Sir, thank you very much for joining us here today and for your testimony and for taking our questions. I'm wondering if you could expand on your comment with respect to the effect on public confidence by real or perceived conflict of interest, particularly around the cabinet table. What effect do those conflicts have on Canadians' confidence in their democratic institutions?
I think the major effect results from the fact that what people hear is from the media, and very often the media will report it in a way that will actually put something in favor or against. The problem is that people will make themselves a decision based on what they see in the media. So it's the perception that is worse than sometimes the actual act himself. People have a tendency to always expect the worst to happen. And especially in time of pandemic, people have what we call a anxiety related to performance of any kind of stuff like that. So for them, as soon as they hear something negative, they take it for granted and they expand on it. And I think that's the biggest issue when there is perception. You're not able to really set the facts straight. And we see more and more now that some medias are not really going based on facts. They're mostly based on perception.
So do you believe that during those times of heightened anxiety, especially, and for example, like the pandemic that we're currently living through, that more caution or real or extra due diligence be undertaken to prevent the damage that can come from those decisions?
I would say that the existing procurement system already has some very good internal control in place, and I wouldn't think there would be extra work to be done. But the thing is, if because of emergency, we are bypassing some existing rules and controls that are already in place, then at this time, I agree, we should be extra cautious. Sometimes we have no choice. In order to speed up the process, we might need to accelerate the process. But the thing is, be careful. If you're putting some internal control away, you need to have extra enhanced due diligence in order to make sure that you have other controls to compensate for the one that were not respected.
So with respect to the 16 conditions that you listed, in this case, we've learned through media reports that there would be real questions about a number of those 16 items. And in a situation where there's only one option that's being presented to the decision makers, and with respect to due diligence having been completed by public servants, if there are gaps in terms of the satisfaction or the quality with which the organization that's being considered meets one of those criteria, how effective is that list if there's not an option? If it's simply a yes or no, and if no, well, we're in a pandemic and therefore we're going to fail to deliver to a very large number of Canadians. So it was presented to us as a binary choice, but in that choice, there were quite clearly, if those 16 criteria were checked, as we've seen in very public media reports since, that anyone looking at those conditions would have found a number of serious areas for concern.
Yes, well, I think that those 16 questions are really there to give you a guideline. The thing is, if there is some of them, as you pointed out, when there's only one option on the table. Well, you need to ask yourself, why is there only one option on the table, and what was actually put to support it, to document it? And I think it always comes down to those questions: what were the answers, and what was documented in order to support the fact that you might say, you know what, this does not apply because of X, Y, Z reason. But I think that you cannot push those questions away. But on the other hand, you need to find alternative reasoning, such as, is it logic that there is only one supplier that can actually provide me that type of service? Before the pandemic, was there more? How come there's only one right now? Some of them have just gone out of business or are not interested. that could be a possibility, but you need to document and support whatever decision has been made.
So we have a conflict of interest and ethics regime, the Act and the Code, and they're not new. I mean, in a historical context, they're in the history of our country, they are new, but they didn't come into force in 2015 with this government. They were in place with during the previous government's tenure. But we've seen a number of very high profile breaches and findings of breaches by the ethics commissioner. But into our sixth year with this government, we seem to see the same behaviors repeated, and we're told that there's more for folks to learn. Would you not say that it's incumbent on the decision makers, on public office holders, to have an intimate knowledge of the rules and to ensure that they're followed in order to protect Canadians' confidence in their public institutions?
As brief as possible, Mr. Tissé.
Yeah, sure. I would think it is one of the responsibility to know them, to make sure they understand them, to receive the training on them if they don't understand them correctly. And as you pointed out, I think the conflict of interest code for members of the House of Commons was put in 2004, if I recall correctly, and the Conflict of Interest Act in 2007. The thing is, sometimes there is a difference between the code and the act in terms of the requirement. And this is something that sometimes might lead to confusion up to a certain level.
Thank you very much, colleagues. Now we'll move on to Mr. Dong for 6 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chair. Good morning, colleagues, and Mr. Tissé, thank you very much for being here with us today. I'm sure that you have had a chance to review a number of government's emergency assistance programs, as you mentioned in your opening remarks. The government has been clear about the need to balance speed of deployment while building back-end safeguards. On par, would you agree that the government has done well?
It's really hard for me to say so, first of all, because I don't have access to all the information, all the facts that were supported. Unfortunately, the only thing I see right now is from the media, so I don't think it would be fair for me to stipulate on that.
Fair enough. With relation to our study here, we're looking at conflict of interest and lobbying in relation to the pandemic spending. For example, buying PPEs for the frontline workers, ventilators for people suffering from worse symptoms of COVID, and even vaccines to inoculate Canadians for the future. Would you say that this spending is bad, that is suffering from pervasive ethical lapses?
Once again, it would be very hard to say. I think the security of people has been put at stake, and I think all the decisions that were made were probably for good reason. It's just, was the process followed? It's all about the procurement process. If it was followed or not, this is where the answer lies.
Okay. I wonder, what advice would you be willing to provide to the committee about the best kind of due diligence that can happen during emergency decision making? I think it's fair to say that COVID-19 is precisely that type of emergency where governments is racing to protect Canadians against the deadly virus. And I remember back in March and February, the entire world, all governments, they were looking for sanitation products. They're looking for anything that relate to protecting their citizens. Even citizens out rushing out, getting all the supplies they need. So in that context, what are some of the best practices when decision making has to be that quickly? And any thoughts on you might have that on this will be much appreciated going forward.
Well, I would say to discuss with senior policy officials in order to see what's the procurement standards, what's the rules and regulation, how are we following them? If there is some that we might not be following because of the emergency, what else can we have in place that could compensate for it and that we can check after? So the first thing is talk with the people with procurement, and then make sure that all officials are really aware of potential conflict of interest, apparent conflict of interest. So I would say Mr. Dion's team that are offering training sometime or will actually provide you some guidelines on specific situation. As I said, one of the items that I was pointing out was to say, you consider conflict of interest before awarding the contract. So I think all of this has to be done before. It's not really rocket science, to be honest. It's just that there is rules that are already in place. We want to make sure that we are actually following them. If we can't for whichever good reason, then we have to support why. But what Canada has in place right now is excellent. For the procurement system, it's excellent. For the conflict of interest code and act, it's good also, but it's just that people don't understand it correctly. And the danger is, I would say, sit down and talk to everyone. That is what I call a CLO, which is a chief loophole officer. You know, the person that would always respect the letter of the law, but never the spirit of the law. That's what you really need to focus on, to say, you know what, there's nothing great in finding loopholes. That's never good. In the long term, it's always bad.
I appreciate that. So it's the ongoing training for staff and conversation with senior officials to make sure this is a very important part of the job, to remind and train everyone in the ministry. And are there particular safeguards you can point to during the crisis, during emergency, that you want to recommend, and maybe some example that you've seen in the past? I'm asking this because obviously the point is that when we are moving very quickly, mistakes are much more likely to happen. I appreciate the 15 points that you list in your opening remarks. Can you offer any due diligence measures during the specific time of the pandemic, or that will provide the safeguards going forward?
Sure. I would say apply the same rules that we had before the pandemic, and whichever one cannot apply, document it, discuss about it, ask people, ask advice. It could be from some external advisors, internal advisors. Ask advice. Say, if I was not to respect this guideline, would I be in breach of something? Just inquire. I would say focus on the one that you cannot really respect, other than just saying, well, I'm going to go through the 16 of them. Say, I'm going to go with the regular process, but if ever I need to speed it up, then I'm going to actually try to see what would be the effect and what I could actually do to compensate for the fact that I might be bypassing existing internal controls.
But the current codes and the laws in place, you think is sufficient to, and it's good to prevent, if everybody knows about it in the practice in their daily life, jobs?
I would say they are, if people are respecting the spirit of the law and not only sticking to the letter of the law. So the one that find the loopholes, they are the dangerous one. They are the threat for the company, or the organization, I should say, or the government. You need to make sure to identify those people and to say, you know what, like, I understand what you're saying, but you're going against, we're not there for loopholes.
Thank you very much. That's all the time that we have. Actually, we're over by about 20 seconds, but that's we have that much flexibility. Mr. Tessier, as well, I wanted to, if you're going to, we have a member who prefers en français. And
okay,
if you're going to speak in French, at the bottom of your screen in the middle, you'll see a translation button there, interpretation. And if you could just put that on.
Clicking on French. Okay.
Oui, certainement, monsieur.
Parfait.
Prochaine députée, Madame Goudreau, pour 6
minutes. Mrs. Gaudreau? Oh, sorry, I didn't hear the interpretation. I was trying to lip read, but I knew it was my turn. Hello, Mr. Tassé. How are you? I'm fine, thank you. Thank you so much for coming here a second time to appear before the committee. We were made aware of the extent to which your expertise is helpful, will help us to add to what has been done. I have so many questions to ask, but I'm going to ask you broad questions and specific ones. My first one has to do with, well, when you say that it's so important to implement an integrity program in order to make sure that you're going to avoid to to have things fall between the cracks or to violate any type of law. And this is relevant, but I would like to know, in your opinion, given that it's even more important during a crisis to make sure to have not only an integrity program, but my question would the government have been able, would it have been feasible to develop an integrity program to make sure that there were no breaches with regards to ethics and conflicts of interest? Thank you for your comment. I think that the answer to your question is that there already is an integrity program. Something's already in place, and it's very good. All we need is it might have to be reviewed and modified with regards to the urgent situation we're going through, but it has to be shared. It has to be made accessible. You can have an update and say, well, I don't know if you recall, but this is a pandemic, and here it is. Most people are not acting in a nefarious way. Sometimes it's something has been forgotten, or they have an interpretation that is erroneous of certain regulations, and I think it becomes important. It's really important to have sessions, short sessions, informative sessions to say, okay, this is what you need to do in different situations. Yes, I do understand. I do understand the importance of training, that people be well equipped to have red flags when for some things, but sometimes even if people have good intentions, are we missing measures for sanctions or consequences, serious consequences? That's a good point. As I was saying, the act has to have teeth. There has to be a consequence. The consequence has to be proportional to the infraction, and so it's the level of seriousness is not to say, oh, you didn't know, and now the third time. No, you have to see if it's a minor or a major infraction. But this is what's the most important thing, is to tell people, okay, we understand, but how could you make this type of mistake, this type of error, if there is no one there to validate the decision? So when people in my riding tell me, how is it possible that our politicians will apologize? They'll apologize. They'll say, I didn't know, I wasn't sure, or I closed my eyes to a certain thing. Well, when we hear, I'm sorry, it seems that there would have been, it seems that more measures should have been taken to avoid having to say, I'm sorry, after the fact. Well, saying I'm sorry, that's a very polite thing, and people appreciate it. It's one thing to say we're sorry, but we recognize the mistake, and this is what I'm going to do in the future so it doesn't happen again. Those are the lessons learned. Yes, I also have a question with regards to the contract with the FTI, with Baylis Medical, that you no doubt have heard about. And you did read the media reports, such as we did, I imagine. And the Prime Minister announced that he had to protect his sources. Is this a valuable or an acceptable reason if you have to act with integrity, if you have to provide information to be called to account as to where the taxpayers' money is being spent? Is this reasonable to say I'm going to protect my sources and I won't disclose anything? I think it's a question of transparency. Transparency can be done in different ways. You can protect your sources while being transparent. Maybe that's not a good answer for you, but we have to ensure transparency. You can say, I'm going to be transparent. I'm going to share what I'm able to share. And I do have to respect some sources. I have 30 seconds left. So what would be an acceptable sanction, so that everyone would think before acting? Well, I don't have access to this entire file, so I can't venture out and talk to an acceptable sanction. Well, if I'm not sure. I don't really know. Okay, thank you. Thank you. My time is up. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Tassé.
We'll move on to Mr. Angus for 6 minutes.
Well, thank you, sir. Your testimony has been very fascinating. I think one of the things that was really striking about this group, is that we realized when we began with Finance Committee, is that the government had really little comprehension about how this organization worked. They knew of We Charity, but basically they knew of Craig and Mark Kielburger because Craig and Mark Kielburger were so closely connected to so many key ministers. They'd invited Minister Qualtrough to one of their big events and feted her. They had the Prime Minister's mother and brother at their events. His wife was working with them. Minister Morneau was closely involved. Minister Chagger was involved. But there was very little due diligence about the actual operation. And I'm wondering about that. And I'm not blaming the civil service, but because there was such a sense of closeness between the Kielburgers and all the key government officials, that it seemed that this was a group that could actually deliver the services, but the questions of their capacity to actually do this were not asked. Do you think that this was one of the problems that got the government into so much trouble with this scandal?
Well, the way you explain it, I would have to say yes. But what is really had been documented would be might be giving us another light on this issue. But I agree with you. We knew a lot about the founders, but we might not have known a lot about the organization itself. And you're right. One of the due diligence that is need to do is not to know about only the people who actually manage a corporation, but about the corporation itself. You want to know the financial structure of the corporation. You want to know the financial stability. In this case, I'm quite sure someone which have documented the decision making and the due diligence process that was done. So I would assume that it was documented. I don't know what came out of it, and if the recommendation that were made, if the due diligence was not done, then that would be very surprising, and that would need to be documented.
I think so. One would assume that these questions would be asked, but in the 5,000 pages of documents, those questions don't seem to have been asked. For example, our committee found out that the board of directors were fired in the middle of the pandemic for asking financial statements, as we Kielburgers were firing hundreds of staff. And my understanding of a charity is the charity board is there to oversee financial propriety. And yet Michelle Douglas told us she had been fired, told to let go. The other board was removed. But none of those questions about their financial capacity was asked in any of the documents the government looked at. They just assumed the We Group under the Kielburgers delivered. Do you think that would be problematic?
That would be questionable for sure. And I do think that it's all about what was the information that was accessible for them at the time of the decision. What was the information that they could have asked to obtain before making the decision? And what was the information that was probably protected under non-disclosure agreements, such as when they were having issues with the board members, now we know why they left, but at the time of the decision, was that information available? Those are the questions that we would normally ask your officials, to say a part of your enhanced due diligence. What did you do, and how did you satisfy yourself?
Yes, because we don't see any of those numbers at all. So when the question of capacity comes up, for example, to make this program work, they had to reach 20,000 students, which in the case of a pandemic in a short few months was quite a number. And yet the Kielburgers claimed they could take 10,000 students immediately. And that really reassured the civil service. Personally, I think the idea that you could take 10,000 students in for one charity where they've fired all their staff deserved questions. Can you really do this? Is this possible? But when they were asked about it, they said, well, we have an agreement with Imagine Canada. Imagine Canada turned around and said they did not have an agreement. Imagine Canada were very clear they did not sign up. They thought there were serious problems. And yet months after Imagine Canada made it clear they weren't getting involved, the government was still using the claim that the Kielburgers were working with Imagine Canada and could take 10,000 students. So that due diligence isn't there. And I'm not blaming the civil service. I'm asking if perhaps, as you talked about the bypass routes for certain actors, because of the comfortability with the Kielburger brothers and all the key ministers, if the civil service just assumed that things would be okay because, hey, it's Mark and Craig Kielburger.
Agree with you. I think that one of the things, and they might have done it, and maybe it's in the 5,000 pages that you said. Ask a letter from the other party to say, are you in agreement did you enter an agreement right now with the We Charity that you would actually collaborate with them and deliver recruits? This is what would have been normal due diligence to do, to ask, because you see, whenever someone is actually reporting to a checklist, well, you ask for supporting documents to validate it. So that's the first part. The second part, I think, is sometime in corporation, we talk about the risk appetite. You do a risk assessment and you consider what is an acceptable risk and not. So in this situation, would be very curious to see what was the risk assessment of that special project.
That's a really good question, and we don't seem to have that. Now, when the agreement was signed, we were all surprised to find that the agreement was actually set up with a shell company, the We Charity Foundation, which in its document says it was set up to handle real estate, but the Kielburgers had many of these numbered companies, shell companies, and so the federal government were going to deliver over $500 million to a shell company, and the board of directors of that shell company were employees of We. To me, it's extraordinary, but there doesn't seem to have been any questions. Would you feel that that would be a difficult or a questionable corporate structure if we were going to give so much federal dollars through basically a shell company that limits liability to the Kielburgers?
As brief as possible, Mr. Tissé.
Yeah, sure. I would say this would be questionable. You would need to document it, and you would really ask yourself, why did they needed to use those corporate structures?
Thank you.
Thank you very much. We're going to our second round now, and we will go to Mr. Gaud for 5 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Merci.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Tassé. Thank you for being here today. It's always very interesting to hear you speak and to welcome you here. I would have a question on the We Charity. It's really interesting because we heard the Prime Minister say that he followed the recommendations of the civil servants, of the officials of the country, to go ahead with the Canada Student Service Grant. But when the officials were questioned, even the head of the Privy Council this summer, he said that there was a lot of political pressure that had been put on them so that We Charity would obtain the contract. He even said that We Charity participated in the drafting of the program even before the launch of the program. Do you think that there could be a conflict of interest when the architect of the program is receiving the contract? Well, it's hard to say because it depends on the level of involvement. Was it only to clarify some points, or was it to really draft the entire program? So the level of involvement would be very important to consider. Secondly, we also have to look and see, well, was this necessary? Was it necessary for this party to be present? And also, when we say pressure was exercised, what was the level of pressure? What was being asked? A quick decision, or what they were saying, oh, you shouldn't ask those questions. So you say that you haven't obtained everything. The level of transparency is important. So did you obtain all the documents? Maybe yes, maybe no. These are the questions that need to be asked. All the steps have been documented. Otherwise, I would be extremely surprised. That would go against best practices, and I don't think that any high official would not respect best practices, except if there was external involvement. It surely is in the file. I would hope so. On another file, and thank you for this answer, it's satisfactory for me. We're aware that and this has done quickly, and they tried to act quickly to help Canadians, but many organizations or professional fraud artists use this opportunity. And we know that a lot of Canadians were victims of identity theft, and for the CERB, a lot of people will receive their T4 and they never ask for this CERB, and they're not even aware that they're going to receive a T4 on a program that they never benefited from because of identity theft. Could the government warn Canadians, those who receive the CERB or other program benefits, even before the tax statements are sent out? It's going to be in a few months. All of this is going to come to a head. That's a good question. I think, yes. If they have it in the database, who received the amounts, they could receive a letter of intention saying, this is to advise you that over the next 2 months, you're going to receive an information sheet, and it will indicate that this amount is taxable. If you don't agree with this information, please contact us. That would be a possible solution. You could say that according to the government files, you receive this money. Another thing that should be looked at is oftentimes money has been cashed, the checks have been cashed by fraudulent entities. And so they might say, oh, I've never received that. And they could advise the government. It would be a proactive measure, proactive and not reactive. Thank you. I think this is a good suggestion. And my last question, access to information. I think it's a really good tool to shed light on some files. I don't know if you use it yourself. Do you use this oftentimes? I hear that access to information takes a long time. You can't tell me if you find it takes too long? I'm been told that it takes a long time. 14 to 15 months to receive information for some files, information that we would require immediately. To end, with everything we've gone through over the next few months, are there lessons that we should have learned? Are there things processes that we should implement? I think that the best lesson is that we realize that ethics play an important role. 2 or 3 years ago, people didn't really know what ethics are. And now I think that this really sheds a light on the importance of ethics and to see how do ethics rules apply to civil servants, to ministers, to MPs. And I think it's really important. It's really important that ethics play an important role. And as I was saying in English, we cannot find loopholes. If we don't agree with the laws, we should amend them, but not find loopholes. That is what takes away from credibility that people have in a system. Thank you.
And now we'll move on to Mr. Sorbera for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chair, and good morning, everyone. Great to be back here on the Hill. Mr. Tassi, thank you for your testimony today. I often like to say and philosophically think about any society in the world that the way that we can ensure we have a good system of government, and what that means is that we have what's called equality of opportunity for all citizens, that they can pursue their dreams and passions without having any systemic barriers in place. And secondly, is government's ability to efficiently deliver products and services to its citizens, be it healthcare that we depend on, be it programs that government's called upon to deliver in an extraordinary and unique period of time that we're in. That to me is how governments are judged. That to me is how society is judged, and that's to me how society evolves, and how in Canada citizens every day rely upon government for literally many things in their life. Safety, we drop our kids off. We want our kids to be in a safe classroom with good teachers, and we require standards. And that, for me, goes into a lot of what you do and you speak to in terms of governance, supply chains, credibility, and so forth. So I thank you for your area of expertise, and I thank you for your testimony this morning. I do wish to just focus my comments in terms of due diligence, because due diligence goes a long way in government and in organizations. That's why we have audit committees in organizations, audit committees in governments, and where things off. And that's why financial statements are audited to ensure integrity. So the first question I have is Mr. Tassi, we heard that as a part of any contribution agreement, and this is any specific contribution, the performance is usually measured at stages throughout the contract, and compensation is only awarded and funding continues to flow only if key performance indicators are being met. Would you not agree this, and I'm being very specific here, obviously referring to what we have in front of us, would you not agree that this is a prudent and responsible approach?
Yes, it is.
Okay. Excellent, thank you. And one thing I brought up in during the finance discussions from the summertime when I was asking questions was due diligence in terms of asking second and third questions. I'm a big believer myself in asking, why are we doing something? I tend to ask my kids, why are you doing that? And I tend to ask all individuals, why do I believe that? And I second question, I third question, because I really want to get at, is, on this level, is a policy the proper policy? And is it? And I think, and I just wanted to make sure, on the, during the testimony, the clerk of the Privy Council, Mr. Sugart, was asked, did the Prime Minister or his Chief of Staff ask the We Charities financial integrity and ability to administer the program to be scrutinized? And the answer from the clerk of the Privy Council was the Prime Minister, Chief of Staff, given the scale of the program, did make the point, which was accepted by everyone, that due diligence and care needed to be exercised with regard to that organization. And I think that goes into, again, the due diligence and asking the questions, especially in specifically this case, that we need to exercise further due diligence. Is that not an appropriate, aren't those appropriate questions to ask during talks between government and organization?
I do think that you need to ask the right questions, and especially the one that you know that people will not want to answer you. There is like normal question that we always ask, and that's part of the due diligence. I think whenever we're time of crisis and we're awarding large contract, and especially sole source, is we need to go what we call the enhanced due diligence. So you need to ask those questions about, like, you see it more in a macroeconomic way, such as, are you going to be able to do the contract? Why are you the only one being able to do the contract? And because very often, if it's only one person that can do the contract, ask yourself, why there's not more competitors? Is it because no one wants to actually do the contract? Is there something that we don't understand in our specification that we ask and that no one want to go because it's not going to be possible? So you need to ask questions and ask the person, what's in it for you? I know it's pretty stupid, but in business, very often we say that. Ask the simple question, what's in it for you? Why aren't you the only one actually proposing for this project? What's in it for you?
Yeah. I just wish to say thank you and thank you for your testimony this morning. Thank you.
Okay, now we'll move on to Madame Goudreau, and this is fast, Madame Goudreau, 2.5 minutes.
Rebonjour à vous.
Hello once again. I have 2 questions. I know that we're awaiting for the report during 2021, and we're looking forward to draw conclusions, but I would like to have your opinion on the Act when it speaks about obtaining a gift or a contract. When we say that it is officials or members of no public office holder or member of the family shall receive a gift. So a gift that might have been given to influence a person in the exercise of their functions. I would like to have your opinion. What is an advantage? Is an advantage different than a gift? An advantage can be in the future. A gift is immediate. For me, a gift is something that I'm bringing. I'm giving. It can be a painting, a bottle of wine. An advantage here, if you're going to take your retirement, for example, I'm going to offer you a job 2 years later if you're a minister. For me, that's an advantage. In English, they talk about undue advantage. I like the undue part of it. So you can have an advantage saying, you're going to be my friend. For some people, it might be an advantage. For others, could be an advantage with regards to career advancement. Okay, I understand why we say for a 5-year period. People have to withdraw for 5 years to avoid conflicts of interest. Now, my next question has to do with criteria for a reasonable knowledge. In the paragraph of the Act, it says that a public office holder should reasonably know if they're participating in decision-making and if there is a conflict of interest. What do you think about this? I think the reasonably, well, if someone made an effort and they asked, if someone made an effort to ask a question, am I in a conflict of interest? Reasonable could be if Mr. Dion, the ethics commissioner, would say, am I in a conflict of interest to participate in a discussion? You can ask your boss. It depends on the level. But reasonable means I thought of asking the question. And if you say, okay, I'm going to come back in 2 weeks, you don't have a choice. You need to go to a meeting in 1 hour. That's what we mean by reasonable. But if you have the idea to ask the question. So if you say, I had a doubt, that's reasonable. Because you're declaring essentially the possibility of a conflict.
Mr. Tassi, now on to Mr. Angus for 2.5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I'd like to follow up on my good friend, Mr. Sorbera, who told us that...
Ça va être en français, Monsieur Angus, ou en anglais?
En anglais, s'il vous plaît.
Okay, parfait, c'est beau.
I want to follow up with my friend, Mr. Sorbera, who told us that the clerk of the Privy Council insisted that we have, the financial capabilities that we question. I think that was really important. That was at the same time the Prime Minister said that he was concerned about, the appearance of conflict of interest. And so they held the WE project back. But having read the 5,000 pages of documents, I don't see anywhere in those 5,000 pages that the questions that Mr. Schuckart's put about the financial capability was ever asked, and no questions were asked about the potential conflict of interest that the Prime Minister found himself in. Do you think if they had taken those 2 weeks and actually done that work, that maybe they would not have gotten themselves in the trouble they did?
It's a little bit cutting off on me. Can you just repeat the last maybe 30 seconds of what you were saying?
Sure. I hope that doesn't come out of my time, Mr. Chair.
Go ahead. I will replenish it because it's technical.
Thank you. Yes, the Mr. Schuchart apparently said that they were going to look into the financial viability of the group before signing off. The Prime Minister also held off signing off because he said he was aware of issues of conflict of interest. And yet we don't see in the 5,000 pages of documents any evidence that those questions were asked. Those were questions that had to be asked. We don't see that they were asked. Do you think that the Prime Minister may not have gotten himself in as much trouble if they had done this due diligence?
Possibly. I would say I'm having an issue with my phone. Okay, I would say it is possible. It would definitely have helped. That's one thing for sure. And I'm surprised why they would not have got the information. But there might be some explanation why. And being a forensic accountant, it always comes down to, is there an explanation? If there's no explanation, then we have an issue. But if there is an issue, an explanation to explain why.
Well, thank you. My final question is on your really important thing on dealing with these bypass routes for certain actors. What we see in the documents is that Craig Kielburger contacts directly Minister Ning. He contacts directly Minister Chagger. He contacts Minister Bill Morneau, says, hey, Bill, talks about his family. And then those ministers contact their civil servants. And yet Craig and Mark Kielburger were not registered to lobby. Their government relations director did not register to lobby. Mr. Kielburger says they didn't need to lobby because they were technically volunteers. They were actually volunteers who had the power to fire their own board of directors. You say that we have rules in place, and I agree, but how do we ensure that people like the Kielburgers can't use their friendships with key ministers to get these deals off the ground when there's no respect for the lobbying code?
Monsieur le Président, on a manqué les...
Mr. Chair, we missed...
And get Mr. Tessé back online here. Mr. Tessé, we can't hear you right now. There appears to be something wrong with your sound. Are you on English right now? We just have our ITs working on it right now, colleagues. Mr. Tessé, they're going to give you a phone call and see if we can work this out. I've stopped the clock, and we'll wait for his answer, Mr. Angus. Okay.
Yes, Mr. Chair. I hope that PMO didn't cut the telephone line. Just putting it on the record.
Is that on record?
It's on record, my friend.
Oh my God! You didn't just say that.
You could put that he said it with a smile on his face. Please make that go into the blues.
Put the
Yeah,
two
we'll
dots and the
suspend
P,
this.
right? And with the tongue sticking out.
Yeah, exactly. A little emoji.
technically, sorry.
Okay, because it's a technical issue, Mr. Angus, I'll allow you to pose the question again. This will be our final question and final answer from Mr.
Okay.
Tessy.
I'm really interested in what you talk about the issue of bypass routes that can be used by certain actors, because we have a lobbying code. It's very strong. We have the Conflict of Interest Act. But we noticed from the documents that Craig Kielburger reached out directly to Minister Ning. He reached out directly to Minister Chagger. He wrote personally to Bill Morneau. He bypassed the normal systems, but he wasn't registered to lobby. And because of his close relations with them, they were very comfortable. And then that project and his ideas were then given to the civil service. And yet he's not registered to lobby because he says technically he's just a volunteer. Do you think that we need to have clear rules about lobbying so that these things would have been recorded and there would have been a better process, and it would have not gotten the civil servants, I think, compromised in the WE scandal?
I totally agree. And let's say we say that Mr. Kielburger might be saying the truth, that he doesn't need to do so because of the fact that he's volunteering. Well, then it means there is a loophole in the law. He found a loophole, and we want to avoid that. So we need to amend the act. We need to amend the code of lobbying. We need to do something. And that's probably what Mr. Dion will do if that is the case. If not, well, probably Mr. Kielburger is actually reading the law in his own way, and he's misreading it. So it's one of the two. But I think that if it's true, well, that would be what I consider to be the worst case scenario. I mean, there was a loophole, and he found the loophole, and he's using it. So you want to make sure that if that's the case, there was a flaw in the law, then you need to change it automatically. You need to amend it in order to avoid that from happening.
Thank you, Mr.
Thank you so
Tessy.
much.
Colleagues, it's 1:02 at the moment. We're past the time of our scheduled meeting. So unless I see unanimous consent to continue on with the one more round, we'll adjourn the meeting. Is there any consent to give two more questioners? I'm just looking. I don't see any dissent. So, Mr. Workington, we'll continue with you for 5 minutes. I should ask Mr. Tessy, do you still have? Do you have another 10 minutes?
Oh yeah, sure. Yes, I do. No problem.
Mr. Workington, it'll be you and Mr. Fergus, and that will bring our meeting to a close. You have 5 minutes, Mr. Workington.
Well, thank you. I think that the testimony has been very helpful thus far. I'm not sure I'll take the full 5 minutes, but I do want to go back to the issue of credibility. Obviously, in the issues that we're reviewing, we have found it very difficult to corroborate different versions of the events that have happened thus far. Obviously, even as has been mentioned by Liberal members today, that obviously there's things that went wrong. There wasn't enough oversight, or there wasn't enough protections to ensure that wrongdoing, or at least a perception of wrongdoing, wasn't undertaken. We had the finance minister receiving tens of thousands of dollars in luxury vacation from the group in which he not only gave money, but was going to give significant amounts more. We know that this group was involved in partisan activities supporting the minister at fundraisers, as well as producing high quality production assistance to the Prime Minister in terms of his own public perception, certainly production of videos and different things, all that was done by this group. And of course, then we had the chair of the group come out and say that people that spoke at events weren't paid. And then, of course, we found out later on that family members of the Trudeau family had been paid to speak at these events, or to attend the corporate elements of these events, which pose a whole nother set of problems if it was in fact that they were there to garner support from corporate interest in support of this charity. And then, of course, we found out that money had flowed through to this organization, not only to this organization, but to an affiliate of this organization that had only recently been created, that in fact was supposed to be there to undertake financial interest for real estate holdings. So there's a lot of confusion, and the credibility of all of the testimony now renders the public to be left to their own imagination. So I do believe that more than ever, transparency and release of documentation that would corroborate this evidence is heightened. I'm not sure if you can give any perspective on what you think should happen in terms of the transparency and the review, the release of documentation that would either corroborate or would clarify what actually happened in all of this.
Well, I think in terms of accountability, transparency is required. And I do think that the information would be helpful, especially because of the fact that we found out that the people who actually gave some statement were not credible because they changed their exposure a couple of times. So I think that the only way to be able to finally find out what's going on is to be able to have access to information that is accessible within the limit of the law. That's the one thing for sure, because we're not doing a forensic investigation, or it's not the Office of the Auditor General who's doing it. But you want to make sure that the information that can be shared will be shared in a timely manner, and also that would be able to put the light on the statement that were made that might not be credible, because as you were pointing out, it's true for people, in order to be able to reinstate their trust in the system, they need to have access to accurate information.
Thank you so much.
Then on to Mr. Fergus for 5 minutes.
You focus your...
I have to figure out how to unmute my mic. Thank you very much, Mr. Tassé. Thank you for your presentation today. I really appreciated this. And your reputation is unparalleled, and also your knowledge is extensive, and this gives a lot of material for our deliberations. Professor Tassé, I have a question for you. When the clerk of the Privy Council testified before the Ethics Committee, as of the first day of the pandemic, the Government of Canada expected some errors linked to the rapidity of the COVID response. And the government took the initiative of contacting proactively the Auditor General of Canada and informed her that audits were expected and that errors might be found. Faced with an unprecedented global pandemic, I'd like to know, with all your extensive knowledge of the situation, isn't that the most prudent action that could have been taken? I think it's a very good action. The most prudent, that's hard to say, but I'd say that it's a very good initiative that was taken. I think what's important also is to see or to say, were the procedures followed? Which ones were not? And was there a potential conflict of interest? The opinion of Mr. Dion could have, or members of his team could have been obtained. I think that this was a preventative approach, but it's an approach given the risk assessment that had been done. When you say we agreed that there might be some errors, and of course that depends on our level of risk appetite. So you have to see what are the risks, what risks were not acceptable and which were. So in contacting the Auditor General, was this in function of high risks that were too high or normal level of risk? And this would be the answer needed to respond to your question. Well, simply the fact that because the government was in the middle of a pandemic and took proactive measures. If I rely on the comments in the beginning of your presentation today, you mentioned that it was important and that, yes, we need to recognize that we are sometimes found in very abnormal situations, but we also have to make sure that we're able to deal with things in order to minimize risk levels. And I think that if I've understood, one of the things that can be done is proactive measures. Yes. Second question, what you mentioned also, you indicated that, well, I would like to know once again, when we talk about political actors, what would be your advice? At what level can political actors get involved in the awarding or in the process that is really managed by the public service? A little bit, a lot, not at all. What is your assessment as a general rule? I think that to define the guidelines, yes, there can be an involvement, but afterwards, with regards to the entire administrative process that goes to the attribution of the contract, I think that there has to be no involvement. But once again, spirit of the law, letter of the law. We have to define the spirit of the law, and then also the letter of the law. And so in this case, to say, okay, what is the spirit of the program? What is the intention? But then you can let the civil servants follow the process, the normal process for awarding contracts. If there's an exception and that people want to come back, well, there can be an exception, but it should not be political that mixes into the administrative, but administrative that can require political assistance.
Merci beaucoup, monsieur.
Thank you.
On behalf of the entire committee, I want to thank you. Thank you for your patience in working through the technical difficulties that we had, and thank you for your testimony. It'll be very valuable in moving forward. Colleagues, that's all the time that we have. We're actually over time by about 12 minutes, so we will see you on Friday.
Thank you very much. Have a safe day. Bye-bye.